Hi, everyone. For this session, I am pleased to welcome Kees Lemmens. Kees is Microsoft's Chief Technology Officer for ASEAN, working with banking, telecom, and energy leaders to turn data and AI into measurable business impact. He has shaped some of the region's most strategic cloud partnerships and brings deep expertise in AI, data platforms, and strategy. A recognized thought leader, Kees offers a pragmatic yet visionary perspective on how generative and agentic AI are reshaping financial services and telecom across Southeast Asia, helping organizations reimagine customer experiences, modernize with confidence, and build platforms at scale for the future. Kees, thank you so much for joining us here.
Kasima, it's my pleasure to be here and to be back in your good moderation hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's get right to it. We don't have a ton of time today, so I'm just going to go right to the heart of it. So current research shows that the majority of AI pilots fail to reach production, and the average enterprise scrapped 46% of AI pilots in 2024. That number is actually a little bit lower than I thought it would be. But from your experience working with ASEAN enterprises, what are the most common reasons you see organizations getting stuck in what we might call pilot purgatory?
It's a great question. And I agree. I think the number is actually on the low end because when you look at across different enterprises, what basically are the drivers for the reasons that AI pilots just never reach production, it's actually remarkably consistent. I think there's 6 of them. So maybe let's just dive in, right? So the first one is really most of the pilots, they start out as tech experiments. There's no proper business hypothesis. There's no real impact done as to how it's going to better the business. It doesn't necessarily even solve a real business problem. And as a result, there's no funding, there's no sponsorship, and projects just generally don't become a reality as a result. The other one that is really important with moving pilots to production is ultimately when you think about the data. So a lot of pilots are leveraging sandbox data environments or batch extracts, and that's just not matching today's reality. I mean, businesses really need secure, low latency connections to core systems, along with clear lineage, drift control, and ultimately data quality assurance in place. Otherwise, you can't scale AI. I think the third one that we often see is like, especially with pilots that are starting out as POCs, it's most often like just, sort of scripts, putting things together. But it doesn't have observability, it doesn't have rollbacks, retries, versioning, etc. So what happens is like, there's a brittle sort of handoff to engineering, and then they hand it off to operations, and operations has no idea what to do with it. Like they can't support it, they can't own it. So it doesn't see production. The fourth one, I do think is also quite interesting, and especially more in the regulated industries, is these pilots, they don't have audit trails, they don't have content safety necessarily enabled, model explainability is often absent, PI data protection is not necessarily in place. When you think about human-in-the-loop approval processes, especially, for example, within banks, that doesn't have necessarily the depth with the business being worked out, and as such, it just doesn't really work because compliance will red flag it and the product won't move forward. The other thing, I want to zoom in on this one a little more later on, but it's really most of the pilots are sort of bespoke individual isolated projects. And there's no AI factory behind it that drives reusability and therefore allows it to scale. And what happens with all of these isolated projects, when you start scaling it, it becomes complexer and it's more costly. And well, that drives abandonment really. And then the last one is really where we're just seeing a lot of users not being properly incentivized to actually use it or drive adoption, if you will. They're not getting necessary training to leverage the AI system in their day-to-day jobs. And also trust is often a really complex issue, whereby if you don't trust the output, you will not trust the system. And when you don't trust the system, you will not use it. I mean, this is pure logic, but it's these 6 that I see over and over across my customers, and ultimately what prevents pilots from reaching production.
Do you think that from the perspective of trust, do you think that there is a new paradigm or new user training that you need to do, sort of set new expectations on using these AI systems?
I definitely do think so. And when we look at like the concept of trust, right? In Microsoft, we always say Microsoft runs on trust, and it's nowhere near as important nowadays as in our AI systems. We want to ensure that the right guardrails in place, that we are using AI responsibly, ethically, but also that the right mechanisms are in place to prevent, I would say, fatal issues from occurring, especially when you do these things at scale. And again, like regulated industries like banking, for example, you can't afford these kind of mistakes. So trust is more than just providing transparency, observability, and so on. It's really like helping the user, the end customer of the system, ultimately feel comfortable with the outcomes that it produces and understand how it got there, why it got there. And I think that's where we would need to focus on more in order to drive that scale.
Yeah, that list of six you have is incredibly, broad, right? You've covered a lot of
Yeah.
different sort of aspects and I fully agree with you that all those things play a role. But one thing that you've mentioned before that I really appreciate, because it comes from someone that you can tell that you've been in the trenches doing this. You've mentioned before that 70% of AI implementation challenges are people and process related. Yet organizations often spend a disproportionate amount of time on technical issues, which is some of the stuff that you mentioned. Can you walk us through a specific example where you've seen this play out and how shifting the focus to human elements change the outcome?
Yeah, I love that. So that 70% number, I believe, comes from an original BCG report and was somewhere around that, right?
Okay.
And it's not a number that actually surprises me. I mean, when we look at most of these AI initiatives, they don't fail because of model quality. They fail because the organization, as we said, isn't ready to actually use and embrace it. So let me give you a concrete example, as you asked. And I will go back to Europe, where I'm originally from, but not ABN AMRO this time. It's another bank. And they basically wanted to automate the heavy, document-intensive kind of work. Think about legal, regulatory summarization, internal policy interpretation, customer compliance checks, product term clarifications, and all these type of things. There's just a lot of documents involved with it. And they wanted to achieve really three things. First of all, they wanted to free employees to do higher value work, like we all want to do, right? Secondly, they wanted to create a well-governed and trustworthy AI foundation that they could then also scale upon. And then the third one that they really wanted to drive was ultimately prove that AI could operate safely within these very strict European regulatory standards. When they started building out their first pilots, they were impressive. I mean, they delivered to basically the core things, right? Summarization of hundreds of pages, no problem. Have it in seconds. When you needed to retrieve relevant clauses for your PSD2 and AML directives accurately, no problem. But after that initial excitement, their adoption stalled. It basically died almost. And the reason wasn't GPU capacity or model accuracy, as we said. It was really human and process friction points. So coming back to that trust component, right? Staff were basically still trying to do all this manual double checking on the outputs because they didn't have a defined idea as to what AI approved meant in a regulatory context. So nobody knew whether or not they could trust the outputs. Secondly, compliance, legal, and IT all were looking at governance through their own lenses. They didn't have a combined view of it. And users were looking at it this is an efficiency project. Am I about to lose my job because of this? So these are all very serious concerns and very much guaranteed to stop adoption, right? And that's exactly what they saw. So if you wanted to put it into a nice sort of phrasing, you would see that your organization was technically curious, but culturally hesitant. And this is what we see over and over again. So they needed to pivot. And when they did, they changed that kind of POC pilot mindset into an actual AI factory mindset. And they started to understand we don't need more models. We don't need necessarily all of these fancy capabilities, but what we do need an actual operating model to serve AI to our customers. And the customers in this case were internal. They adopted, and this is a bit of branding, but it's important, Azure AI Foundry as really their orchestration and governance layer. AI Foundry allowed them to basically manage all of their AI across their different markets with built-in content safety, with monitoring, with responsible AI guardrails, and the right governance. So they had that backbone that they could trust. They also shifted from a cultural component. They basically started to create a shared rhythm between risk, data, and engineering teams to drive that single layer governance view. And then they started to build reusable and smart AI assistant capabilities. And capability concepts here are important. You don't want to design something for a specific problem and not being able to use it. So by doing that, they then started to think about, okay, how do we shift the focus also from replacing humans towards designing for humans in the loop and actually catapulting the level of skill, if you will. And the result was a solution that had traceable citations, and employees would be able to flag inaccuracies, drive corrections. They understood how the fixes were flowing back into the AI ops. And all of that transparency helped really reduce ultimately the skepticism towards the solution. The other thing that they did, and I think this is so important, they built compliance reviews into the actual workflows. So every document and output was logged for audit and lineage. It's not just being reviewed by a team weeks and weeks later, but it was actually available immediately. And as a result, the teams that are working with this start to see the assistant really as a sort of colleague, like the way it was intended, and not just a black box that they couldn't trust. And when teams start to work with it, the organization quite quickly identified like the people that were really excited about this. Can we turn those into AI champions that then become basically sort of the peer-to-peer providers of training, the ones that gather feedback, the ones that coach, and really help shift the organizational mindset of and the fear of will AI replace me versus how can AI free me from repetitive work? And as a result, adoption rose sharply, productivity was very measurably improved, but maybe more importantly, that really scalable AI foundation became also part of an AI factory that allowed them to scale, and that's now being used for even agentic AI workflows.
Keith, I love that answer. It's got so much insight from a perspective of really having sort of walked through the fire. It's incredibly real world and very production oriented, and really that's what we're here to talk about. I want to dig in a little bit, and maybe it's incredibly helpful to hear about the human aspect, and I think that's something that people don't think about enough. But some first questions that come out, about moving things to production, a lot of the times when integrating with these legacy systems, that's one of the top barriers to scaling AI into a production system. And when you're advising enterprises on moving from isolated pilots to these production systems where they need access to ERP and databases and live transaction flows, maybe in a more technical way, what's your practical approach to managing this complexity?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Honestly, it's probably one of the most underestimated challenges. It's not like, there's a cookie cutter answer to this. Most of the pilots, right, as I said, they're sort of built in isolation and they work beautifully in that context. But then when you want to connect them to live systems such as your core banking or ERP, CRM, or whatever, right, you normally hit a sort of wall. And I call that integration shock. Building for AI at scale means building real-time data streams. And none of these systems were designed for hot path data flows. So what often happens is, A, you basically overload the systems, and B, you create all kinds of quality issues as well, right? So I think it's a sort of three-step approach to think about how to tackle this challenge. And the first one will be to stabilize the data foundation. And we talked about this like a while ago, but I can't emphasize how important that is. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we start defining the systems of record with therein what data the AI can actually trust to use. And yes, Microsoft Fabric would allow you to, for example, create consistent data products with that clear lineage with that ownership. And I know this sounds super basic, but ultimately, when we look at it, 80% of the scaling issues probably come from not knowing your gold data in terms of like, where does it reside? What is the actual quality? What's a common definition that we share on it? So the data foundation is crucial. Next, you want to think about how do we ultimately standardize the connection model? Here we can start thinking about, instead of point-to-point scripts, how do we create management across reusable connections and event-driven pipelines, and turning that in really an ultimate governance service layer, if you will. So when the next AI use case comes along, you don't need to rebuild the plumbing. And then the third one is really scaling. So ultimately, you want to think about how do you drive orchestration and observability into it. And I do think it's really best to bring everything under AI Foundry, because this is where you get unified modeling, model control, service telemetry, and all of that is just in one single place. So it's not so much about replacing legacy. It's more about how do we web and orchestrate around it so that you ultimately set AI free and make it accessible through that API layer, governed data, and ultimately clear observability. I think that's the crux, or the crux, if you will, to managing legacy at scale with AI.
Well, you mentioned Foundry, but Microsoft recently introduced this agent framework that's specifically designed for enterprise-grade AI deployment. And so can you explain how that fits in with the picture? How does this address some of the fundamental barriers that keep things stuck, especially around some of the things you talked about, observability, durability, compliance, things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good follow-up question. Actually, I love that. So when we think about the original idea of can the model actually answer this correctly? Then that's one component, but that's not where enterprise is. Enterprise is more about, can I trust? Can I observe? Can I govern the AI system in production, right? And that is really where the framework tries to sort of create that leap, or that bridge, if you will, and turning experimental pilots into durable, observable, and compliant enterprise systems. But it started really when we had two frameworks originally, right? We had semantic kernel, which was really designed for developers to give them SDKs with connectors, content moderation, and the telemetry elements. And then we had in the research labs, AutoGen being built that really opened the door to experimental multi-agent orchestration. But the developer community said, why can't we just have one framework? Like, why do we need two different frameworks? It's super confusing. So we ultimately worked very hard to integrate it, and that became the Microsoft Agent Framework. And what it does, if you simplify it, is basically it makes the invisible visible to observability. And it really ensures that you can trace why a model gave a certain response, how users are performing, when drift begins, and all of these things. So it basically has this open telemetry framework on which it's founded. And then embeds basically end-to-end logging and evaluation into that. And it also allows you to monitor response, quality, latency, the lineage, and even ethical metrics like content safety, harassment, and all of that, all real time. So that's one component. The other component that it brings is that resiliency. So we said this earlier, right? Pilots are often fragile. Like imagine if an API breaks or even a schema in a database changes. Oftentimes when you run a pilot, the whole pilot goes down. You can't have that in production. I mean, it's just not an option. So you want to make sure that you bring within the framework, and this is what we do, really equipping AI with state management, retries, rollback mechanism, version control, pipelines, and all of that is orchestrated. And by the way, that framework is really built in natively now into Azure AI Foundry. And it gives you that enterprise reliability pattern really for AI systems at scale. The third thing that it does, and I do think is possibly the most important of it all, and this is just my personal preference, but it brings governance by default. So when you have enterprises, especially in those regulated sectors that we discussed earlier, you need proof of safety, you need proof of auditability. And the framework really enforces that through responsible AI policies, through role-based access, through content moderation. And therefore, every prompt, every retrieval, every output is logged and reviewable. And that's, so important. It's not like just we're bolting on compliance. It's really a core principle now of the design. And it's even further enhanced by integrating policy as code into your system so that it becomes really a standard part of the blueprint that you're rolling out with. And I think this is really, really fundamental and really cool, to be honest, because we've been waiting long for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of getting a system working to getting in production require, what we used to say is, as soon as the code works, you're like 10% of the way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So seeing Microsoft put out these tools that really understand what it means to get things really live is really exciting and very helpful, I'm sure. We've covered a lot of the technical aspects and some more topics, and I would love to keep on going deep with you on these kinds of topics. But I think the scope of Microsoft's suite of AI products, especially going to the enterprise, and the scope of your work probably expands beyond just sort of like the deeply technical things. One of the things you've spoken about are practical use cases for Copilot in enterprise. And so when organizations successfully scale Copilot beyond their initial departmental pilots, for that kind of product that is much more end user oriented, what kinds of organizational changes or governance structures do they typically need to implement?
Yeah, so we provide different, I would say, toolkits for ultimately different purposes. And Copilot and Copilot Studio is really the easiest way in which you can start building AI agents. But whether or not you use AI Foundry or Copilot Studio, I think the fundamentals of your organizational design don't really change. So you still want to think through this quite carefully. And most organizations, they start with these small experiments with small teams, and they work in isolation, and they start to sort of like feel a need that ultimately they need to scale that. And by doing so, oftentimes what we see is that your organization moves into what we call a hub and spokes model. And that's really like a central IT team or a central AI team that then provides the governance, the standards, the shared platform, shared infrastructure, builds often types of use cases out. And that model, it works, but only up to a point. I mean, I just can't imagine how a large bank, for example, is going to push out hundreds and hundreds of AI use cases through that model. And this is where we see that if you want to truly operate at scale, you want to sort of think differently. And, if I came from a data world, I saw the data mesh in reality. And I really do believe that this concept of what I call the AI factory mesh model is ultimately where a lot of the enterprises are evolving towards to. And what does that mean? The mesh model is still a central hub, but the central hub in this case defines really the guardrails, including governance, security, evaluation, and responsible AI policies. But more importantly, the spokes really become sort of the empowered AI delivery capabilities in their own right. So each business domain, say retail banking, say risk, HR, and so on, then basically has its own AI team and can build their own domain-specific co-pilots and even AI systems, but they're all backed by the same governance and the same guardrails. And I think that's really, really super critical. And as a result, you create sort of this federated network, if you will, of AI builders across your organization who operate safely within the same compliance and observability framework. And that really allows you to unlock innovation at scale, but also have that control at scale. And I think this is where our solutions really are quite cool, because we provide a shared services model to do so. We have the right capabilities to manage API and connections, as well as the data products and data catalogs. And we also provide that monitoring across basically co-pilots and even agents, right? So that federated model to make it work at that scale, the technical capabilities are all there. But to your point earlier, the AI champions and the expert communities are equally critical in making sure that works. And we actually are starting to see some of the banks now moving towards this model and starting to adapt it. And we're seeing great success with it. So I definitely think that the mesh model is ultimately where the future sits. But we will all start sort of in the same paradigm of a hub and spokes model to just get warmed up, if you will.
That's a really helpful a frame to sort of look at things in. And if we want to talk about success stories, I really want to dig into that a bit more, because I think you have a very unique perspective as the ASEAN CTO for Microsoft. I mean, I feel like you can see a very specific part of the world and see the sort of differentiation that sets it apart. Now, looking at those scaling stories, the successful scaling stories you've seen in ASEAN, what do you see as common characteristics that these organizations share in terms of leadership or culture or operational approaches that make scaling these AI systems into their organization successful?
Mm. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, and I would like to answer it in two folds, if I may. So, first of all, I do think there's three levers that basically facilitate it, right? You want to start with clarity and a very clear purpose as to why you're doing these things. As I gave that example earlier, like that switch from basically automated to automating the paperwork was a really important kind of switch in messaging. So the intent needs to really be clear, but you also need to create trust with the people that you're trying to drive change with. Secondly, you want to think about the confidence. Like we touched on this as well. Like you want to design for trust and transparency. Like you want to show how AI works, how you can give users control. And the companies that do that well, they succeed and they ultimately roll out a lot faster. And then thirdly is that community aspect to it. Like you want to have ultimately a sort of infectious, and maybe not the right word, but anyways, like an infectious kind of peer-to-peer change organ to AI champions and to guilds that allow you to basically drive the change and foster it. Because change doesn't happen from the top down. People get inspired top down, but the change itself doesn't happen top down. You need that body within the organization to just spread it. So that's my frame and my simple lens of looking at it, if that makes sense. SCB does this actually really well. I mean, you guys came up with this idea of the digital brain and then leveraged basically Azure AI and data services to unify the customer intelligence across retail, SME, wealth segments, and so on. But everything you guys do is tied back to A, a KPI that's linked to the business, B, to the initiative, and C has also a set of owners around it that will ultimately drive that sub-initiative to the organization. And I think this is critical.
Well, it goes back to what we had mentioned earlier, which I really appreciate that it ultimately comes back to the organization and the human element of it, right? It comes back to people.
100%.
And I mean, I think that this is true about all technology, right? We're perhaps seeing something that's unique and it requires more change, but again, the human factor is really the one to focus on. Well, Kees, we're running out of time, so as we wrap up, I just want to ask you about any upcoming Microsoft developments or initiatives that the audience should be aware of that could help them bridge the gap from AI experimentation to enterprise-wide sort of AI scaling or value creation.
Yeah, great question. So we have had a good conversation and I have so much more to share. But anyway, so let me leave you with this. All right. Microsoft, I do think, and I truly believe this, is uniquely positioned to help enterprises bridge that gap between AI experimentation and then scaling it up to enterprise-wide AI-driven value creation. We have all the foundational components like Entra ID, Azure API management, but also the advanced platforms we discussed like Copilot Studio, Azure AI Foundry, Fabric, Purview, and so on. But if you really look at the vision of Microsoft, we're trying to bring basically together systems, data, and AI in a way that's never been done before. It is really a unique solution set that we're trying to bring. And Ignite will be coming soon. We'll be sharing some real cool innovations that show you how we make this real. I mean, we will learn more about the agentic AI patterns that we're very strongly advocating. We're learning more about model as a service, which I think is quite interesting. Fabric and Foundry will be even finding deeper integration than today, and that's highly necessary. Purview will improve further as well, really driving further governance capabilities, better streamlining the product, and again, also the deeper integration. So I think these are some of the great things that are coming for organizations. For developers, specifically, GitHub Copilot now basically integrates already seamlessly with the Azure AI workflows, and it enables them to go faster to production, right? But banks and telco, for example, have complex data models, and they're still struggling with how do we translate that Now we're bringing these capabilities into Fabric and into agentic workflows as well, with in basically designs for regulated environments. And that will be coming out really, really soon as well. I can't say exactly when, but that's something to definitely look forward to in our world. And then personally, I'm actually working with my team locally to build out a very detailed white paper around what is an AI factory, how do you set it up, how do our production solutions play into that, so that it becomes sort of the playbook for fashion, really. And I think that's something to look forward to as well.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing that white paper. Well, Keith, first of all, it's very exciting to see Microsoft really go for it in this age of AI,
Yes.
and I'm really excited to see it. And second of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really fabulous insights. I wish this was 3 times longer, but I but I think that we're out of time. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's been a real pleasure. I really look forward to doing this again. And next time we go to another topic a little bit deeper, like fantastic, man. Thank you.
That would be great.